Hamburg, June 1945. The city wasn't destroyed. It was erased. Roofs collapsed. Walls split. The air thick with lime dust, smoke, and decay. The smell of death mixed with rain and plaster. People moved like shadows through streets of rubble. Silent, slow, eyes gray from hunger and fear. On June 3rd, the first American armored units entered the western districts. An M4A3 Sherman tank stalled at Ganzmarkt. No fuel left. The soldiers climbed out, lit cigarettes, and stared at the ruins. From a nearby doorway, a barefoot woman appeared, waving a white sheet tied to a broom handle. She didn't speak. One soldier handed her a tin of rations. She took it with both hands like a sacred object. Of Hamburg's 1.7 million pre-war residents, barely 900,000 remained. Half were women, 180,000 children, 45,000 elderly, and countless uncounted, buried, missing vanished somewhere between the Elbe and the Alster. The U.S. Army called them displaced persons. They called themselves alive. Orders were strict. No fraternization, no private contact with civilians. But orders don't survive hunger. A can of Spam meant safety. A cigarette meant a favor. In the ruins, everything had a price. The Americans came searching for archives, officers, documents. What they found were basements full of survivors. Women and children wrapped in blankets, eyes empty, faces white with plaster dust. A sergeant wrote later in his log, "We came as victors. We arrived as witnesses to extinction." The Stadtpark had turned into pasture. Horses grazed among bomb craters. There was no power, no clean water, no transport. People burned books and furniture for heat. Whole families lived in cellars lit by candles made from melted soap. By day, American patrols mapped sectors. By night, they shared coffee and canned meat with those who dared to approach. Every exchange blurred the line between occupation and mercy. One of those women was Anna Weber, 28, former secretary at Blohm and Voss shipyard. Her husband was killed at the Oderfront 3 weeks earlier. On the evening of June 4th, she approached a U.S. Jeep at Reeperbahn and asked in broken English, "You from America?" "Yes, then I live." She began cleaning the soldiers' quarters, sweeping floors, washing uniforms, sometimes just sitting near their stove. In return, they gave her food. Within a week, they called her Annie. The official police log for June listed 1,628 disciplinary incidents, civilian contact in the American sector. The real number was likely 10 times higher. Each case was filed, investigated, and quietly forgotten. Hamburg existed in a new kind of balance. The conquerors didn't feel victorious. The conquered didn't feel guilty. Between them stretched a silence that replaced morality with necessity. When Americans said, "Come with me," it wasn't romance. It was survival. It meant warmth, bread, protection for one more night. That was the new language of peace. Short, hungry sentences exchanged in the ashes of a dead empire. Hamburg slept without lights. After sunset, the city disappeared, replaced by shadows and memory. The blackout wasn't enforced. It was total. No electricity, no street lamps, no trains. Only the faint red glow of smoldering ruins. People navigated by smell and habit. The official curfew began at 9. Patrols moved through streets that no longer had names. Their orders were simple. Maintain order. Report incidents. Avoid contact. But order meant nothing in a place without law. At 10:15 p.m., Sergeant Williams noted in his patrol book, "Light seen behind curtains. Wholesome Wall 84. Checked. One woman, 2 children, candle stub, said she was waiting for her husband. Didn't ask which army he was in. By then, most of Hamburg's surviving men were either prisoners or corpses. The women handled the negotiations of existence. They lined up at American kitchens and whispered in English they barely knew. "Bread, please. Work, help." The first supply convoys reached the U.S. sector on June 5th. 22 tons of powdered milk, 13 of wheat flour, 2,400 gallons of kerosene. The rations were intended for soldiers only, but within hours portions vanished into side streets and basements. Lucky Strike cigarettes replaced coins. Coffee replaced loyalty. Anna Weber understood faster than most. She started translating between locals and American quartermasters. Simple words, gestures, lists. She wasn't paid officially, but soldiers handed her chocolate, sugar cubes, soap. She carried them home, wrapped in newspaper like treasure. On June 6th, the order arrived from SHAEF headquarters. All fraternization with enemy nationals remains strictly forbidden under penalty of court-martial. The same day, military police reported 350 new violations. Hamburg's moral structure collapsed in silence. Hunger dictated its own hierarchy. One lucky strike could buy a kiss, a loaf of bread, or an hour of safety from another patrol. The city turned into a marketplace of fear. A diary recovered years later from a bomb shelter read, "They came not as monsters, but as men with food, and that's what breaks you." The American soldiers didn't think of themselves as occupiers. They were young, restless, drunk on adrenaline and relief. They handed out rations to women twice their age, shared blankets, sometimes laughter. Then the morning wrote it all down as incident reports. Anna's nights blurred into routine. Scrubbing, washing, sleeping beside her jacket to stay warm. She learned the rhythm of army life. Reveille at dawn, rations at noon, curfew at dusk. The soldiers joked, played cards, argued about going home. She listened, smiled when they did, ate when they let her. The city adapted. Black markets grew in cellars and tram stations. A gold ring was worth 16 pounds of flour. A bar of soap, half a kilo of coal. Every object translated into calories. Even human attention became a currency. Anna began keeping notes again, the habit of a clerk who once recorded shipyard schedules. Only now her entries were trades. 2 eggs, 1 soap. Bread, 1 hour washing. Meat, 1 body. When asked months later why she wrote it down, she said, "Because numbers don't lie, even when people do." By midday, Hamburg was divided into invisible zones of barter. Soviet rations on one side, American Lucky Strikes on the other. Between them, women walked miles each night carrying baskets filled with whatever could be exchanged. Soldiers called them market girls. Civilians called them the moving ones. A phrase began circulating among the Americans. "Come with me." They said it half jokingly, half command. It was the new password of power. Short, universal, undeniable. In a city of ruins, everyone followed someone. By the end of June, the first flowers appeared between shell craters. The war was over, but the peace that followed it had no language yet, only gestures of survival. Private Miller shared his creations with Anna while explaining baseball. She didn't understand the words, but recognized kindness. Sergeant Williams taught her to say thank you in proper English. She taught him to say bid in German. Small exchanges that meant everything and nothing. The contradictions lived in every moment. Official hostility wrapped around human warmth. Orders forbidding contact while necessity demanded cooperation. By July 1945, Hamburg was starving with discipline. The city's average daily ration for civilians had fallen below 980 calories. The U.S. Army Medical Corps reported outbreaks of typhus in Altona and St. Pauli. Their solution was DDT sprayed from jeeps like snow covering children, bread stalls, and corpses alike. It worked against lice, not despair. In the American sector, every object became negotiable. A gold watch equaled 16 pounds of flour. A wedding ring equaled 2 cans of Spam. One night, with an American soldier, could mean a week's worth of rations. Nothing was theft anymore. It was arithmetic. Anna Weber wrote her own math in a notebook once used for Blom and Voss invoices. Flour, 2 Lucky Strikes. Soup, 1 smile. Bed, 3 cans. Her handwriting stayed precise, the tone detached. Numbers gave control where morality could not. U.S. intelligence officers called this phase economic reorientation. The truth was simpler. Survival through trade. Lucky Strike cigarettes were the new currency and soldiers were its bankers. At Stat Park, Sergeant Williams' patrol noted women approaching supply trucks in organized groups. Organized was the wrong word. It was instinct. They waited for engines to stop. Hands already out, not begging, just calculating. He wrote, "You start thinking about what hunger costs when you realize it's cheaper than guilt." The Americans confiscated German money. Worthless Reich marks printed by the millions. Lucky Strikes took over completely. One cigarette equaled 12 marks. A pack could buy a family's week. By midsummer, entire underground markets formed around army depots. One report estimated 3.4 tons of goods traded daily in unofficial exchange. Anna adapted faster than most. She found an interpreter's job at Fuhlsbüttel, translating for quartermasters. Her payment wasn't in cash. Chocolate, soap, coffee, small things that smelled of civilization. She shared some with her neighbors, who in turn shared rumors. In a city without laws, kindness was also currency. The Red Army looted the East Side relentlessly. Factories stripped, machines shipped to Moscow by the ton. The Americans pretended to enforce discipline, but theft ran both ways. Soldiers traded gasoline for gold, ammunition for whiskey, rations for company. The official term was local adjustment. One internal memorandum from the Counterintelligence Corps, dated July 1945, stated bluntly, "Fraternization is uncontrollable. Prevention no longer feasible. Recommend silent tolerance." At night, the markets became social gatherings. Women came with baskets. Soldiers came with duffels. Someone played an accordion. Someone laughed too loud. Deals were struck with gestures more than words. Morality faded into routine. Hamburg's churches filled again, not for worship but for food lines. Priests distributed powdered milk under crucifixes made from salvaged iron. In sermons, they didn't speak of forgiveness, only endurance. Anna's American friend, Private Miller, helped her once when her ration card was stolen. He forged another, copying an officer's signature by memory. She asked why. He said, "You do the same for me." She didn't answer. By late July, mortality dropped for the first time since the surrender. People were learning to live on less, to measure success in grams. But with each passing week, something invisible eroded. The sense that life might one day return to what it was. The official Allied report for that summer reads, "Civilian order restored. Morale acceptable." The streets told a different story. Kids scavenged in uniform pockets. Women cut their hair to trade it for soap. Men came back from camps thin as wires, looking for homes that no longer existed. Hamburg wasn't rebuilding. It was learning to function while broken. And through it all, the same phrase echoed through stairwells, alleys, and checkpoints. Sometimes it meant food. Sometimes it meant shelter. Sometimes it meant nothing at all. But in a city built on ashes, it was the only sentence still alive. Autumn 1945. The air over Hamburg turned to dust again. But now it was organized. What hunger had created, bureaucracy perfected. Every building with a roof became an office. Every survivor a file. Americans called it reconstruction. The Germans called it routine. The Reich mark was worthless. Inflation above 650%. Lucky Strike cigarettes had replaced paper money entirely. One cigarette equaled 12 marks. One carton could buy a bicycle. The real power belonged not to generals or politicians, but to anyone with access to American supply depots. A cook with a key could feed a family. A driver with a truck could control a district. Private Miller was assigned to logistics at Stat Park Depot. His daily records listed cargo in tons. 26 of flour, 8 of coffee, 5 of gasoline, and miscellaneous humanitarian goods. The goods never reached their destinations. Some ended in the black market, some in officers' quarters, some in the hands of women waiting outside the fence. Official loss ratio 19%. Unofficially, no one bothered counting anymore. Anna saw the system forming and learned to survive within it. She was now an interpreter for the Economic Division, translating German requests for American permits. Every conversation began the same way. "We need paper." Everyone ended the same way. "We'll see what we can do." She discovered the real currency wasn't food anymore. It was permission. A new class of Hamburg residents appeared. The intermediaries. Not soldiers, not civilians. People who could translate between chaos and order. They wore American jackets over German shirts, spoke both languages with equal cynicism, and it became one of them. The Americans liked efficiency. The Germans liked the illusion of rules. Together, they built a machine that ran on signatures instead of fuel. In 3 months, the city issued 127,000 new ration cards, 38,000 work permits, 5,500 marriage licenses, and countless forged documents that looked just as official as the real ones. In August, an American major named John Hartley wrote in his field report, "We are maintaining order by manufacturing paperwork faster than the Germans can eat." The contradiction didn't matter. On paper, Hamburg was healing. On the ground, it was feeding on itself. Anna used her position to help others, sometimes honestly, sometimes not. She arranged passes for neighbors, filed fake medical exemptions, even hid a few wanted names and translation errors. When Miller confronted her, she said, "The truth doesn't feed anyone." He didn't argue. At the same time, the Soviets stripped the eastern factories bare. From the Deutsche Werft and Halswerk plants alone, 420,000 tons of equipment were shipped east by train. The Americans, unwilling to appear weak, quietly began their own extraction under the name Operation Paperclip. Scientists and engineers disappeared overnight, flown to bases in Texas and Ohio. In official records, they were listed as missing. The people left behind learned silence. You didn't ask where someone went. You didn't ask why. Hamburg existed between two truths. One printed in newspapers, the other whispered in kitchens. A German phrase spread through the city that autumn. Besser nicht fragen. Better not to ask. By September, the first cafes reopened, serving acorn coffee and black bread. They filled with men in borrowed uniforms and women in borrowed smiles. Outside, the rubble women kept working, passing bricks hand to hand 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. The posters said Aufbau nicht klagen. Bill, don't complain. They did both anyway. For the Americans, life settled into rhythm. Inspections, convoys, reports. For the Germans, it settled into endurance. The black markets didn't disappear. They went underground. The lucky strike for now, just symbols of something larger. A system built entirely on unspoken bargains. And in that silence, the phrase remained. It outlived regulations, papers, orders. Soldiers said it softly. Civilians repeated it with resignation. Sometimes it was an invitation, sometimes a command, sometimes a warning, but it always meant the same thing. Someone had something the other needed. Spring 1946. The ruins began to bloom again, but the soil was still poisoned by memory. The rubble women kept passing bricks like metronomes. 12 hours a day, 75 grams of bread per shift. Officially, Hamburg was rebuilding. In reality, it was rehearsing a version of hope it no longer believed in. The Americans reported progress in numbers. 89 million cubic meters of debris removed. 14,000 power lines repaired. 52 schools reopened. The statistics looked clean. The air still smelled like smoke and rain. Anna worked now for the Public Information Division, translating propaganda scripts for newsreels. Every line began with the same phrase, "The new Hamburg rises." She read it so often that the words lost weight. The film showed children smiling beside American soldiers, cafes reopening, church bells ringing. None of them mentioned starvation, prostitution, or the bodies dug up when the frost melted. She'd once written everything in her notebook. Now she stopped. Paper had become dangerous. A single sentence could decide your future. Private Miller was transferred to the Information Service, driving film reels between districts. His job was to deliver images of peace. He'd seen enough of the real city to know they were lies, but lies were lighter cargo. One day in a theater on Montbergstrasse, he watched the new reel play. It showed women sweeping rubble, soldiers handing out chocolate, children waving at the camera. The narrator's voice said, "Democracy rebuilds what tyranny destroyed." The audience sat in silence. When the lights came up, no one clapped. Someone whispered, "They film us like animals." Miller left before the next showing. By summer, the city had learned to function like a machine again. Efficient, exhausted, obedient. The black markets became permanent. The lucky strikes turned into Deutsche Marks. People with connections became officials. People without them became ghosts. Anna saw it all from behind her desk. Stamping forms for work permits, marriage licenses, relocation passes. The names changed. The hunger stayed. Once she saw Miller's name on a file, transfer to Frankfurt. She didn't call him. There was nothing left to say. The official documents described her as translator, reliable, cooperative. The reality was simpler. A survivor who had traded everything except her silence. The Americans began leaving in waves. New faces replaced old ones. Trucks rolled out of the city, loaded with typewriters, spare parts, and stolen paintings. The soldiers left behind tried to believe they had done something noble. They hadn't conquered evil. They just inherited its ruins. In the final Allied report of 1946, a single line summarized the entire experiment. Reconstruction achieved through managed memory. The phrase was perfect. Nothing about Hamburg was whole, but on paper it was finished. Winter came early that year. Miller, now stationed near Frankfurt, received his discharge papers. He carried nothing home except his uniform, his notebook, and a small photograph, blurry, overexposed, of a woman standing among ruins, holding a white bed sheet like a flag. He didn't remember when he took it. Back in Hamburg, Anna walked through Reeperbahn as snow began to fall again. The city had lights now, weak, yellow, trembling, but it was enough to see her breath. A group of American trucks passed slowly, engines humming. She stopped, watched them disappear, and whispered something to herself that no one heard. History would later call that period peace. The archives would list it as post-war normalization. But to the people who lived it, peace wasn't a date. It was an echo somewhere in the ruins. The same words that began everything still hung in the air. Half command, half mercy. And the city, tired of choosing sides, finally obeyed. The transformation from a city of ruins to a functioning port took 3 years. But the real change happened in the spaces between official reports, in the conversations that weren't recorded, in the silences that spoke louder than speeches. Anna Weber had learned to survive by translating between worlds. By the time the last American convoy left Hamburg in 1949, she had become something new. Not German, not American, but something forged in the space between them. Neither German nor American, but something between. A woman who had learned to translate not just words, but worlds. The skills she developed during the occupation, reading between official lines, finding hidden meanings in bureaucratic language, negotiating between competing authorities, became valuable in the new Hamburg emerging from the ashes. By 1947, she was working for the newly established Hamburg Chamber of Commerce, helping coordinate trade relationships between German businesses and Allied procurement offices. The same networks that had once moved lucky strikes and chocolate now carried legitimate commerce. The underground economy was becoming the foundation for legal reconstruction. Anna kept the small notebook from those early days, the one where she had recorded trades in stark arithmetic. 2 eggs, 1 soap. Bread, 1 hour washing. Meat, 1 body. Sometimes she would open it and read the entries, trying to remember the woman who had written those calculations. The precision of desperation seemed foreign to her now, like reading someone else's diary. But she understood that those careful records had taught her something valuable. How to measure human needs against available resources. How to negotiate when both sides were desperate. How to find dignity in survival. The American administrators who remained in Hamburg often sought her advice. They called her practical, efficient, someone who understood how things really worked. They didn't know about the notebook, about the nights when she had slept beside her jacket for warmth, about the time she had chosen silence over truth to protect people whose names she couldn't even pronounce correctly. What they saw was competence. What they didn't see was the cost of that competence. The phrase that had defined those early months, "come with me," evolved into something more formal. Written invitations to business meetings, contracts for translation services, official requests for cultural consultation. The desperation had been bureaucratized, but the essential transaction remained the same. Someone had something another person needed. The difference was that now they wrote it down in triplicate. Hamburg's port began functioning again in late 1947. Ships arrived, carrying goods that weren't stolen, distributed through channels that weren't black markets. The rebel women finished clearing the last debris from the main shipping channels. Children who had grown up eating chocolate bars from American soldiers now attended schools where they learned English as a foreign language, not as the language of survival. The Marshall Plan arrived in Hamburg like spring after a long winter. Money, materials, and machinery flowed through the port that Anna now helped coordinate. American dollars replaced Lucky Strike cigarettes as the ultimate currency, but the transaction patterns remained familiar. Someone had something another person needed. The difference was scale and legitimacy. Anna found herself translating between German dock workers and American engineers, between Hamburg business leaders and Washington bureaucrats. The conversations were more complex now, involving shipping schedules and cargo manifests instead of bread rations and soap trades, but the essential human negotiations hadn't changed. Trust still had to be earned one transaction at a time. The old notebook stayed locked in her desk drawer at the Chamber of Commerce office overlooking the Elbe River. Sometimes, during long meetings about reconstruction contracts and trade agreements, she would remember those first desperate weeks when a single lucky strike could determine whether someone ate that day. The distance between then and now seemed impossible to measure. Private Miller never returned to Hamburg, but his photograph remained in Anna's apartment, tucked between the pages of an English dictionary she had taught herself to use. She had learned that he married a girl from his hometown in Illinois, had 2 children, and worked at a factory that made tractors. The information came through official channels, part of a veteran tracking program that helped former occupation personnel maintain contact with their assigned districts. She wrote him one letter in careful English, thanking him for his kindness during the difficult years. He never replied, but she understood. Some experiences were too large for letters. The Marshall Plan brought new Americans to Hamburg, civilian administrators, and technical experts who spoke of efficiency and modernization. They were different from the soldiers who had arrived in 1945. These men carried briefcases instead of rifles, wore suits instead of uniforms, talked about economic integration and democratic institutions instead of survival and necessity. Anna worked with them, translated their proposals, explained local conditions, but she recognized that they belonged to a different story. Their Hamburg was about rebuilding. Her Hamburg had been about not dying. By 1948, the city had electric lights again, running water, functioning telephone lines. The rebel women had cleared the last major debris piles. New construction began on sites where bomb craters had become neighborhood gardens. The emergency was officially over. The reconstruction had officially begun. But late at night, when Anna walked home through streets that now had names again, she could still hear echoes of those first desperate months. The phrase that had once meant survival now meant opportunity. Come with me to the planning meeting. Come with me to inspect the new construction. Come with me to negotiate the shipping contract. The words had gained respectability, but Anna remembered when they had been whispered in ruins, when they carried the weight of life and death decisions made in bomb basements. The new Hamburg, rising from Marshall Plan investment, bore little resemblance to the city she had known in 1945. Glass and steel replaced rubble and ash. International corporations established offices where black markets had once operated. The Reeperbahn, where she had first approached that American Jeep, now featured legitimate nightclubs catering to foreign businessmen rather than desperate civilians trading dignity for food. Anna had become successful by any measure that mattered to the new Germany. She owned an apartment with central heating and a telephone. She employed 3 translators and maintained contracts with both German reconstruction agencies and American development firms. Her English was now fluent, her professional reputation solid, her financial situation secure. But success felt hollow in ways she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived through those first months of occupation. The new Americans who came to Hamburg treated her as a valuable local contact, someone who understood both languages and could navigate the bureaucracy efficiently. They didn't know that her expertise had been purchased with hunger, that her diplomatic skills had been learned while wearing the same dress for 6 weeks, because it was the only one she owned. The Chamber of Commerce elected her to the board of directors in 1949, making her the first woman to hold such a position in post-war Hamburg. The ceremony was held in a renovated building that had been a bomb shelter during the war. She stood on a stage where families had once huddled during air raids, accepting applause from an audience that included American officials and German business leaders. During the reception, someone asked her to give a speech about the future of German-American economic cooperation. She spoke about mutual benefit, shared objectives, the importance of understanding cultural differences. She said nothing about Lucky Strike cigarettes or the sound of empty stomachs. Nothing about sleeping next to her jacket or writing survival calculations in a notebook that now stayed locked in her desk. The applause was polite and brief. Afterward, she walked home through streets that hummed with prosperity, past cafes where people complained about coffee that was too weak or bread that cost too much. She thought about the distance between gratitude and memory, between survival and forgetting. The new Hamburg was built on silence about what the old Hamburg had cost. In her apartment, overlooking the busy Elbe River, Anna kept the photograph Miller had never known he'd taken. A woman in ruins holding a white sheet like a flag. Sometimes she studied her own face in that image, trying to remember what hope had felt like when it was indistinguishable from desperation. The notebook remained locked in her desk at the Chamber of Commerce, but she had memorized every entry. 2 eggs, 1 soap. Bread, 1 hour washing. Meat, 1 body. Those calculations had taught her more about economics than any textbook, more about diplomacy than any university course, more about human nature than any philosophy. The Marshall Plan officials who worked with her saw efficiency and competence. They didn't see the woman who had learned to measure the exact weight of hunger, who had discovered that dignity was a luxury that could be rationed like bread. By 1950, Hamburg had become a symbol of successful reconstruction. American delegations toured the port. German officials gave speeches about cooperation and mutual benefit. Journalists wrote articles about the miracle of recovery. Anna translated their optimistic phrases, their forward-looking statements, their careful avoidance of uncomfortable truths. But late at night, when the official visitors had returned to their hotels and the speeches were filed away, she would walk through the Reeperbahn and remember when that street had been a marketplace of desperation. The phrase that had defined those early years still echoed in her mind. Come with me. It had meant survival when survival was uncertain. It had meant trust when trust was dangerous. It had meant hope when hope required enormous courage. Now it meant business meetings and development projects and the ordinary negotiations of prosperity. The transformation was complete, but Anna understood that forgetting was also a kind of death. She had learned to live with both the woman who had written survival calculations in a notebook and the woman who now sat on corporate boards. They were the same person, separated by time and circumstance, but connected by an unbreakable thread of memory. Hamburg's rebirth had required both the desperate pragmatism of 1945 and the calculated optimism of 1950. The city that emerged was neither the one that had been destroyed nor the one that had been imagined. It was something new, built on foundations that few people wanted to examine too closely. Anna Weber had become part of that new city, but she carried the old one with her in a locked drawer and a faded photograph. The echo of 3 words that had once meant everything.